Welcome to Filmmaker U's weekly chat where we discuss film with a film professional. This week, we're going to be sitting down with Grant Elder to discuss his work as a sound designer, a sound editor, as well as a re recording mixer on films such as Hillbilly Elegy and Ad Astra. Welcome to the show, Grant.
Thanks for having me.
So, I guess one of the questions I wouldn't mind starting with is that, what would you say in sound, in film, uh, is something that needs to be talked about or discussed that isn't really being discussed? Because I find that in the film industry in particular, we all get focused on the technology or certain elements of the craft, and then other areas sort of get ignored. What would you say needs more discussion in sound?
Very good question. First thought, just off the top, really is sort of the collaboration process that we have with producers, editors, directors, things like that. Typically when we start a project, we'll get the script, read it, review it. But a lot of times it's after the filming has been done and the edit's been locked, or oftentimes not fully locked, but I'm a huge advocate at bringing the sound department on post sound early in the process, as early as possible, even at script stage.
Mm-hmm.
That gives us a chance to connect with the director and the sound recorder and the crew there to work out, creative ideas or technical ideas for how they might, shoot a scene, or things that we might be able to gather from production recordists, that'll help us further down the line. And that's something I know that some people are speaking about. I know the legend Randy Tom is pushing this a lot. I think that's amazing. Some of the best soundtracks that I've been a part of have been, our collaboration has started at the script level with the director. We're talking about creative ideas, sort of the sonic landscape of what's gonna be presented to the audience. And then from there, throughout their filmmaking process, they can come back to us while they're shooting, send us dailies, sound rolls, ask us questions technically about how it's sounding. And then once they get into the edit, we have this great rapport going. We can then talk about library sounds that we maybe want to send over to them to help inform their edit, and get their temp tracks really sounding good. And that pushes us so much further along, when it gets time to turn over to us, because we have spoken about all of this awesome creative stuff. They have a great sounding track for us. There's ideas laid in there from the editor. It pushes us so much further along in the process. And then, if we have, for instance, great production sound effects that the recordist has gotten for us, I mean, there's nothing cooler to me than sweetening the perfect production sound, especially on, New York sort of walkie talkies, where we don't necessarily deal with huge, massive sound design jobs. It's really, about the subtleties in the film that connect the viewer to that experience. So a lot of that production recording is, if it's good, that really makes the scene magical to me.
It's
So
interesting. Oh, sorry.
yeah, go
Well, I
for
was
it.
gonna say it's interesting that you say that because when I started in film, I started in sound and then moved over to editing. And back then, the frustration was always it was an afterthought. It was always sort of like, oh yeah, we just find a sound person, right? Um, and it almost feels like um, the sound team should be brought in at the stage where the cinematographer is discussing their approach and the editor and making it more collaborative at that stage, basically.
Absolutely. We want to help the project as much as we can, and we want to build relationships with all the filmmakers. It's really beneficial to the project and for the community. I feel that we all get together early on and start sharing ideas.
Now, you worked on Hillbilly Elegy. So, what were some of the challenges as a sound designer that you needed to take into account for this film?
Well, we actually did get involved in this one pretty early on. Ron and James and the whole crew actually brought us into a friends and family screening. And so we were able to start discussing ideas. I'm somebody who likes to go out and record as much as I possibly can for the film. And so I was starting to map out ideas. I actually got an opportunity to go back to Ohio and Kentucky to record some sounds for this film. And so that collaboration we were in really good shape once we kicked off the film. I think some of the challenges for the film was, this film is almost like a documentary, and Ron really pushed for that. The cinematographer has a lot of experience in documentary work, and he really wanted to tell this story in a, do it justice in a realistic and dramatic fashion. And so a lot of the sound design that I wanted to, deliver to the film would have been living in this ultra realistic realm, right? Because, these incredible scenes with these characters, you want to live in these moments and have this visceral response for the audience. And so creating this ultra authentic atmosphere for these scenes without crowding the dialogue or, overdoing it was a big part of what I wanted to do. And also another big challenge for this film was creating these handshakes. It jumps between time periods of JD's life as the film goes on. And the editor, James, challenged us at a very early stage. He sat us down, we did some spotting, and a big mission that he gave us was to, lend a hand to the edit in creating these transitions between time periods. And so we also worked a lot with Hans and his crew on basically when we were going to pass the baton to them to make that happen, or perhaps lean on sound design for that. And there's some moments in the film where music takes it and it's just incredible. And then there's a couple really cool moments in the film where sound design sort of carrying that lead. So we really share that responsibility, but that was also a big challenge.
So how did you figure out the, as you mentioned earlier, the sonic landscape for the film? Like what were some of the things that you looked to create that?
Yeah, like I said, it's a very character driven story. The performances are just out of this world, right? So a lot of what I wanted to do was sort of live in these subtleties of the landscape. I mean, there's obviously some big scenes where you're seeing, all kinds of action. But, most of the film, I wanted to sort of create this subconscious, visceral response for the audience, living in this ultra authentic, immersive world where, you're focused on the characters and what they're saying, but subconsciously what you're feeling, what these, the frequencies are giving you is this authentic atmosphere that transports you to that scene. And so that's a big reason why I wanted to go back and record. I'm actually from Dayton, which is about 20 minutes down the road from Middletown. And so I was familiar with the area, but when I got there and started recording, I started to really get blown away by the character of these places as far as the sounds that I was gathering. There's freight trains that roll through that town constantly. It's a post-industrial town. And a lot of towns have freight trains, but as I'm recording, I'm realizing that, so I got the locations from the Post Super. So I was actually hitting the locations of where they shot. And so it was so incredible to me to gather the actual reflections of that neighborhood and slot those into those scenes. And, you're also getting these little interesting pop outs of maybe a guy was, roofing down the street, or there's a person with a leaf blower a few blocks away. And also the car buys there are much different than you would hear elsewhere, right? It's not, you've got your big V8 Hemi truck going by and, maybe like a rattly old Suburban or, Cadillac or something like that. So I was getting these really interesting car buys, and it was these incredible little subtle things that, when I cut it into picture, you don't necessarily consciously know that's happening. But to me, especially when we did the final mix in Atmos, it was so immersive and cool to have those perfect reflections and these the exact sounds that you hear in that place. That just completely, a couple of those scenes just completely transported me. It gives me chills sometimes when I watch it.
Did you do anything special for Atmos for the Passover?
Yeah. So Middletown, there's a couple cool Atmos moments. Early in the film, actually, the opening sequence, I went to Kentucky and recorded in the Cumberland Gap National Forest. And I gathered some sounds there that were incredible because it starts off in the holler and you're basically in that area of Kentucky. And you have this canopy of trees. I was on a hiking trail. And so the birds are bouncing off the trees and you get this sort of like cacophonous echo. It's really nice. And so I was panning that stuff around, but also adding what I like to do sometimes is throw my verbs like a 7-1 reverb into objects. And so it really fills the space. And so that was some stuff I did. And there's actually there's this really cool dragonfly shot where it comes over you and I think from top bottom on the screen lands and then flies off left. So that's my big Atmos moment. It's not Star Wars, but it was really fun to fly that dragonfly around. And then, little things like panning the sounds that I was getting off. And also there's a really small little airport, private airport in Middletown. These little Cessnas are flying around all the time. And I didn't get to put that in all the time, but I snuck it into one scene. And so I was flying the Cessna planes all over the tops and surrounds and things like that. So
Now, have you ever like, because there's a sound designer here where I live that likes to record his so if he's doing Atmos, he likes to set up all the mics and try and record it that way and get the sounds that way. So when you're doing things like um the forest sound and getting the bird sounds, it sounded like you were using one mic, but do you ever go out and set a whole kit and record the sounds?
I'm usually running and gunning, so my mic setup's pretty minimal, and I like to work with stereo tracks. I don't have anything against using quad or ambisonic and things like that. For me, it's just what I like to do. I like working with a pair of stereo tracks and panning those things. I do a lot of my imaging in the mix, right, with that. So maybe I'll turn around and do a recording if I think what's happening behind me is cool. But it's usually a composite of just a lot of stereos.
Oh, interesting.
Yeah.
Now, did you actually read the book before getting on this film, or was that just went straight with the script?
So I hadn't heard about the book until we sort of got word that this job might be coming through. And, being from Dayton, being from that area, well, first of all, I always read the book if a film is coming through and it's based on a book. I always try to do that. So I was definitely going to read it. But the fact that it was about a character from where I'm from, who also has a lot of similarities I have in my life, I was all for it. So as I was reading the book, I actually was back in Dayton, and the book struck me hard. Like I said, there's a lot of similarities there in JD and me, and so I got really amped up about the project early on. I was bringing a lot of emotion and passion to the cut every day. It was a lot of fun.
Now, with your having lived in the area, was there any little sort of nuance that you could, I mean, you mentioned like the cars and stuff of the actual area, but was there something that, um, beyond that, in a sense that you were like, oh, this is something very specific to this area that I can hide in here and
I was getting everything I could, even down to my buddy's doors, because some of my buddies live in the houses that look just like where JD grew up, and I was like, I have to go get these doors. I mean, it's just I got everything I possibly could. Stairs, Mamaw comes down the stairs in one scene. It's real creaky, and boy, what else? Yeah, there's so much stuff in there. There's a lot of personality in there that's all from Middletown in Kentucky. So
is there a scene in there that you're particularly proud of that you sort of hold up as like, this is the scene that I nailed it?
so there's this scene early in the film. It's after Bev scolds JD, and she comes out and sort of offers to take him to go get some baseball cards to make up for, you know, what she had done previously. And it's not a huge design scene at all. And you know, I've mentioned the recordings I got, but obviously a lot of this stuff is, you know, you go sort of to the library for things that you don't have. And like I said, it's not a big design scene, but the ambience of that scene, it's the crickets and the guy with the lawnmower down the street and the airplanes and you know, just the overall sonic landscape, the frequencies of that scene. When I watch it, it gives me chills because I am instantly transported back to that neighborhood. It's that suburban soundscape. And for whatever reason, all of those things in that scene just nailed it for me. And I sort of liken it to when you listen to an album, you know, that you listen to sometime in your past that you're emotionally connected to, you know, that those sounds, that those frequencies sort of subconsciously just transport you back to that time period, and you're so like emotionally attached to that you're remembering things that happened to you, good times, bad times, that sort of stuff. And so, you know, the goal again was to create these ambiances and live in these subtleties and sort of subconsciously try to transport the audience into these scenes like that. And that for me was really, really cool. And that happens a few times throughout the film.
Now, what this is a bit of a pivot, but when I was going through your IMDb and all your work, you started in 2014, and you right away you sort of moved up very fast. So for a lot of young people getting into the industry, how did you sort of craft your career path so that you could get to where you are now?
Yeah, and real quick, just want to give a big shout out to Bob Hine and Josh Berger who worked with me on Hillbilly. Those
Oh
guys
yes, yeah, of course.
was an amazing team. Love those guys. So yeah, I started out. Boy, what a story! Where do I start? Uh, I actually got my start at a commercial house in New York City. I had an internship right when I basically graduated college. I moved straight to New York, had a couple internships lined up. Um, One was at a commercial house, and one was actually at Harbor, which is where I work now. Um, when both of those internships ended, I didn't get hired at Harbor, but I got sort of hired at this commercial house to uh, basically sell and run this recording kit that we had made. It was a mobile recording kit. And that was sort of like my weekly stipend thing. And I was so bummed because I had interned at Harbor. Back then, I was actually interning, doing, you know, random things, but working a lot in the picture department. And when I moved to New York, you know, in college, I had been doing heavy like sound design experimentation, things like that. I was playing music. So I definitely knew that I wanted to work in sound. And so I was really bummed that that didn't work out. But I stayed in touch, and eventually the commercial studio that I was sort of working at shut down. And I was like, oh boy, man, I'm in New York. I don't have a job. What am I going to do? So eventually I sort of just stayed in touch with the folks at Harbor and crossed paths with the CEO, Zach. And I sort of pitched him these ideas that I had for, you know, different services and things like that. And he was like, cool, this all sounds great. Why don't you come in? We'll talk. And we'll see what's going on. So I come in, and he wasn't able to to get to the meeting, but I met with Avi Laniata, who's our head engineer here at Harbor on the sound side, one of our chief engineers on actually a lot of things, who's a remarkable human being. But I'm pitching him all this stuff. I'm shaking in my boots. I'm like freaking out, and I don't know if I was just sort of blabbermouthing all over the place. But he looks at me and he's like, "What do you want to do?" And I'm like, oh, well, to be honest, I just want to come work with you guys and sound. Like, that would be magical, you know? And he's like, okay, here's what you do. Start coming in, like, just start hanging around, and I'll teach you what I can. And so, you know, I wasn't necessarily getting paid, but I was coming in and I was hanging out with Avi, and I was over his shoulder all day, every day, as many times as I could a week. I'm sure I bugged the hell out of him back then, but he taught me so much on the technical side of things. And so I learned a lot from him, and eventually got an opportunity here at Harbor to basically be a technician on a picture and sound kind of job. It was a thing called CBS Upfronts. So I was teching Avids and Pro Tools at the same time. And that's kind of how I got into Harbor. So basically from there, I just really tried to dial in, work hard, learn as much as I could. And eventually I started basically teching at one of our sound facilities. And from there, I was just a sponge. I was, doing my day-to-day stuff, but also just asking supervisors, editors, anybody I could ask, what they were doing, what was going on, just trying to get all the information I possibly could, and then do stuff on the side. At night I was doing short films and student films and things like that. And so shortly after that, I became a mix tech. And that is really when I got to dive in and really sort of meet people, create relationships, learn the trade. I learned from so many incredible mixers and sound supervisors. Lee Dichter, who's a legendary re-recording mixer from New York, like one of the best dialogue mixers of all time, was such an influence on me. I got to tech with him on a number of films, and he shared so much knowledge with me. And also, he worked in all DSP on the console, so no Pro Tools. He was all faders, knobs, and meters. And so, I'll never forget the lessons he taught me. And I'm really, really grateful that I got to learn the fundamentals of mixing that way before, this Pro Tools really took over, and we're all sort of living in this digital world. But to learn from him on the old school kind of analog way, I think learning those fundamentals of mixing really pushed me forward and gave me confidence in what I was doing when I'm on the board. And so, that was sort of what I was doing for a few years. And I just tried to make myself as indispensable to every project as I could, and sort of grow that way. And so you grow experience and you gain relationships and you work hard so that when you get the opportunity to mix or, edit or supervise something, you're ready to go, right? So I was just doing everything I could to prepare myself for the moment where I was going to maybe try to get a break and sort of step in. And that came shortly into that. I got a chance. There was a film that needed some fixes on the mix. I was mix teching for. And I went to the supervisor. They were looking for all these mixers, trying to find a mixer to book, really experienced guys. And I went to them and I was like, hey, I was petrified, by the way. I was terrified to do this. I don't know what gave me the courage to do this, but I just went into his office and I said, hey, is there any way you would give me a shot, to mix this stuff? And he looked at me and he was like, that's a really interesting idea. I'll bring it to the crew. And so they brought us all together and I had to do a test mix. So they sat me down and I mixed a scene and they were like, oh yeah, it sounds pretty good. And so from that point on, I think my career really started to, take shape, and people started to trust me on the mix stage. And like I said, I come from a musical, designy, technical background. So and that's what I love to do. And so, I was always telling everybody, hey, I like to do this stuff. And I was building things on the side and delivering things to people that weren't, people weren't expecting that. And so when the opportunity came for me to get a design job, I was ready to go and really, tried to nail it as much as I could. And so that kind of snowballs, right? You create those relationships, you do good work, and hopefully those people keep coming back to you. And that's kind of how I got started.
Now I have one last question that I'd like to ask everyone I interview.
Yeah.
We've been through this whole COVID, well, we're still going through this whole COVID chaos right now. Um, but we've had a lot of people have had times to sort of sit at home and do nothing because a lot of things are shut down in certain areas and what have you. So is there a show or a movie that you discovered on your streaming services at home that you're like, people have to check this out?
I really enjoyed The Sound of Metal
Oh, I
on
saw that. It was
Amazon.
great.
Oh man, I thought those guys did an excellent job with the soundtrack. You know, I
Mhm.
did Sound of Silence, which I
Yeah.
think you had Eric the DP on. You know, to obviously to get that opportunity to work on a film that has sound so embedded in the script as a character like that, it's you know, it's a blessing really. And I thought those
Yeah.
guys really just did an excellent job. And obviously the acting is just off the charts. I really enjoyed that film. Yeah.
Well, apparently it's roughly based on a true story.
Oh, I'll tell you what, as a person that, you know, makes a living with their ears, it
Oh
was
my
a
god.
nightmare for me. I mean, it was like painful to watch.
Oh, it was hard.
I was frightened. I was like, I love everything that's happening. Like everything I'm so into. I love this soundtrack, but I'm like, I'm in pain right now watching this. It's scaring the hell out of me.
Well, and like the ending felt like the movie 400 Blows, where it's like he got what he wanted. He got his hearing back, but it's not exactly what he wanted. And
It was such an
so,
emotional roller coaster. I tell you what, you know.
yeah. Well, thank you so much for letting me interview.
Oh, thanks for having me. I'm so grateful, and thank you guys for doing this. I think it's awesome, you know, keeping the
Fantastic.
community together.
Great. Thanks, guys.
All right, take care.
You too.